Sometimes low expectations can be a good thing. Ender in Exile by Orson Scott Card. This is labeled as book 1.5 of the Ender Quintet, and I'll start with telling you about how that's wrong. But I'm going to structure today's book review a lot different than what I've done previously. I'm going to make it a lot shorter, and it's going to be 100% spoiler-free. I didn't feel that there was anything in here that I really needed to talk about in a spoiler fashion that I think was very important. So what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to, before I tell you why the marketing for this book is so wrong, I'm going to tell you 3 things that I liked about it, 3 things that I didn't like about it. You can tell by my little cold open that I liked it more than I expected because I went in with super low expectations. So 3 likes, 3 dislikes, then I'll do a wrap up where I'll give you my final summation as well as my rating. But first of all, let me tell you why this is wrong. It says on the cover here, After Battle School, The Lost Years. That's true. It says the direct sequel to Ender's Game. And I think that is one of the inherent problems with this book, because it's not a direct sequel to Ender's Game. The big climax of this book has to do with a plot thread that started in book 3 of the Shadow series. So if you were at the bookstore and you pick this up and, I read Ender's Game, I love Ender's Game, I'm going to read the direct sequel, you're going to be so totally lost by what is the big climax of this story. I think that's one of the reasons why so many people hate this book, is because it's totally mismarketed. This should be considered part of the Shadow series, not the Ender Quintet. Although Ender is the main protagonist of this book, it really belongs in the Shadow series because it picks up that last dangling plot thread that was still stuck there at the end of Shadow the Giant, and it completes that story. Now, does it do other things with Ender? Sure, and I'll talk about that. But I think that's one of the big things about this book. One reason it is so universally panned as one of the worst books in the Ender saga, because I mostly enjoyed this book. Let's go into the 3 likes and dislikes. So my first like is just simply Orson Scott Card knows Ender Wiggin. And being back in Ender Wiggins' point of view was so fantastic. Unfortunately, we didn't get enough of it, so that's kind of a dislike in one of these 3 likes that I talk about. But when Ender's Game, we got about 90% of the book from Ender's point of view. We get about 50%, maybe even a little less here, so it's not as much as I would like, but every time we got the point of view from Ender, it was just great. Card just writes this character so well. He is just so endearing, and you just connect with him as a character, and those were the best chapters of this book. So that's what I enjoyed most, really, was just getting back and being part of Ender's point of view chapters. Not that I didn't enjoy being in the Shadow series, but I just thoroughly enjoyed this. Number 2 in the like category is the world building. This book was able to do a lot of that. Part of it is because it did jump around point of view from different colonies, Earth, people in transit between colonies, so you got a lot of that. The other thing that Card does really well, and he's kind of fine-tuned this in the last few installments, at least from a chronological read standpoint, is that he utilizes the chapter epigraphs as email exchanges to be just perfect exposition dumps. An exposition dump by itself is often, an inelegant thing in a book, but when he does it in the form of an email, which is essentially an email is an exposition dump, it works really, really well. So he's able to, just at the headings of all these chapters, he's able to just very, very easily build the world and the universe so much more. This book did so much for the world building that hadn't really happened in a lot of the other books. So I really love that aspect of it, because we did see the greater world that we'll start to experience in these later books. The third thing that I liked about this book is it did kind of bridge the gap between Ender's Game and Speaker of the Dead. There's a big time gap. We meet Ender in Speaker of the Dead. He's a much older person, and although I think that book, it's been 10 years. I'll let you know in 2 months when I reread it. But I think that book does a good job at kind of filling in the gaps. This does a much better job because you get to see the whole journey of Ender leaving Earth, the travel to the colony, and even beyond there. Because Card does a lot of time jumps in this book. Part of that I'll talk about in the dislike section, but it does kind of fill in the gaps, so that is something that I think was probably the biggest purpose behind why he wrote this book. When I read, I always try to wonder the purpose behind a book, whether it's to tell a certain story, to explore a theme, to explore a kind of character. I think the purpose for Ender in Exile was just to fill in the gaps of Ender's story from the end of Ender's Game to the beginning of Speaker of the Dead. All right, let's talk about the dislikes. Number 1, the plotting and pacing. This was rough. And it wasn't until, as a reader, I totally reframed what I thought about this book that I was able to have any enjoyment whatsoever. The reason the plotting and pacing is tough is because each chapter is almost its own self-contained unit. So once I realized that, and I looked at it that this isn't a novel, it's a series of 23 different chapters. And I stopped having the expectation that when I left a chapter, the next chapter would pick up where we left off. I started to enjoy it. When I looked at it more as maybe 23, not necessarily short stories, but maybe like vignettes about what is going on in this time frame, I enjoyed it a lot more. That said, there were still some really interminable chapters. I think one chapter in general that felt like it was 900 pages long and just kept going and going and going as Card explored some other characters and some other situations. So the plotting and pacing was a problem, but I do recommend if you go into this book, don't think of it as a big cohesive novel because frankly it's not. If you think of it as just a series of vignettes, you'll probably enjoy it a lot more than if you think of it as that single novel. Second dislike, and this is a hate, and I continue to be appalled and frankly disgusted at Orson Scott Card's treatment of female characters. Because for the third book in a row, Shadow Puppets, Shadow the Giant, and now Ender in Exile, we have a seemingly intelligent woman that at some point just has to blurt out to the alpha male in her life that she needs her babies right now. And it's frankly disgusting that someone can write the female gender this way in the 21st century. I try not to get angry about it and rant about it like I kind of did in the Shadow Puppets review, but it's appalling. It's disgusting. I don't understand. Philip Chase in his live stream a couple weeks ago talked about when he gives a review, he tries to imagine that the author is in the room with him so that he's respectful to the material. And I love that approach. I mean, that's a great approach. So I would say if I were in the room with Orson Scott Card, I would ask him, why do you think this way about women? That at some point, virtually every single female character in your books just goes baby crazy and forgoes all sanity? I don't understand. I find it disgusting. And it's happened 3 books in a row. Now, if it happened in either of these books, you can easily, in all 3 of these books, you could come up with a plausible explanation in that book. But the fact that it's happened 3 times in a row, that's a trend that tells me that this author may think of women that way. And again, it's unsettling. I don't like it one bit. It is what it is. All right, my third dislike about this book is, I'm going to contradict myself a little bit. I talked about how this filled in the gaps between Ender's Game and Speaker of the Dead, which it did, but frankly, with the exception of the one dangling plot point that was from the Shadow series, this really didn't add anything to the story. It didn't really add anything to the Ender universe of note. Even Shadow Puppets, the book that I have ranked lowest of all of these books that I've read so far this year in the Ender saga, even that added some great ideas of, being in Petra's embryos and nature versus nurture. There were some thematic elements in there that I think added something to the story. I really don't think this really added much. And you can find out in December when I do my final summation of this series and I give you my reading advice. Because much like the Dune novels, my reading advice with the new Dune novels was to read the first 4 and to stop and to not read Heretics and Chapter House. If I were to make that decision right now, I would say Ender and Exile is one to skip. So my final summation. It's not as bad as people think. I ended with my 3 dislikes, but I did like aspects of it. When I changed my reading perspective and read this as 23 separate vignettes, I enjoyed it a lot more than before. And it was great to just be back in Ender Wiggins' point of view. For my rating, I gave it a 3 out of 5, which a 3 out of 5 is a favorable rating for me. That means that I liked the book, and I did like the book. I don't feel it added much to the Ender universe and is probably a skippable installment. But overall, I really don't regret, the 4 or 5 days that it took me to read this. So up next for me next month in this grand Ender reread is Shadows in Flight, which is the 5th book in the Shadow series and has to do with Bean and his children in deep space, trying to stay alive long enough for them to solve this medical mystery. And I don't remember a thing about it. So I'm really looking forward to reading it because of all of the books, I remember a lot of things about all of them, but I don't remember anything about Shadows in Flight. So if you're following these reviews, I will give that review hopefully in the last week of August. Sorry this one was late. I was a little under the weather, didn't have a voice. Still don't have much of a voice. Didn't have a voice to be able to shoot this video earlier. But if you like this video, please like and subscribe. You can also follow me on Twitter and Goodreads for more content. As always, thank you for watching. Until next time, goodbye.